These past 3 weeks has felt like months waiting for this guy to come out, but alas, Shikanoe Heizou is finally here, and I can say with absolute certainty he is one of the most enjoyable and satisfying characters I've ever played. In this video, however, I'll be going over his abilities, playstyles, artifacts, weapons, teams, and yada yada. Now, if you see my first video on Heizou, I basically talked about everything there was to know about his kit and what artifacts and weapons I think would be good for him, and if I'm going to be honest, there's going to be a lot of repeating stuff. But before you click off, I didn't talk about a lot of other things that I should have in that video, so I'll be trying to answer all of your comments and then some more things that I forgot to add. Also, this is sort of going to be my first time making a full in-depth guide, so if I do bad, then just flame me in the comments or something. Now, without further ado, Heizou's normals are sick. He's basically just a fisticuffs character, punching and kicking every enemy in his sight. His elemental skill makes him do a really heavy punch, but does a good amount of damage, but when you hold it down, it gets a little more complicated. When you charge up your skill, you gain these declension stacks, which increase your skill by how many times you stack it. When you stack it up to 4, which is the max, you get another effect called conviction, which increases the damage even more. His elemental burst makes him kick out this big animal ball, slightly grouping enemies and dealing an extra instance of damage if the enemy is affected with any kind of element. Now let's talk about some of his passives. His level 40 passive gives him a declension stack for his elemental skill when he triggers any kind of swirl reaction. So if you have another character on your party that can apply off-field elemental damage like Xingqiu, Fischl, or most recently I guess Yuan, you theoretically never have to charge up your skill and can just tap it whenever it comes off cooldown. His level 70 passive gives your team 80 elemental mastery for 10 seconds after he hits an enemy with his elemental skill, and his default passive is just a 20% decrease in sprinting stamina consumption, which is pretty cool. Alright, abilities and talents are pretty straightforward, so let's move on to his constellations. Since he's a 4-star unit on a banner that a lot of people are probably going to pull on, a lot of players are most likely going to get some duplicates. His first constellation gives him 15% attack speed when he enters field and 1 declension stack for his elemental skill. This is honestly a pretty good constellation for C1, but it doesn't directly increase his damage in any way, so let's move on. His C2 makes his elemental burst suck in enemies from a further range and acts sort of like a mini venti burst for like 1 second. His C3 just increases his elemental skill level by 3, which is pretty good because that's the main damage dealer. His C4, probably not one of his best in my opinion, because all it does is it charges up his burst a little after he uses it. Now, the reason why this constellation is generally not that useful is because his burst cost is already only 40, which is insanely low. If you have another animal unit on your team, then this constellation is basically useless, but if you don't, then it can come in handy. His C5 just increases his ult's talent by 3, but his C6 gives him 4% more crit rate per declension stack for his elemental skill, and when he has max stacks, his elemental skill gets its crit damage increased by 32%. Again, really good on Heizou because it essentially just gives you 16% more crit rate and 32% more crit damage on his skill, which is actually really good. Alright, aside from his abilities and such, let's talk about some of his weapons. Now, I don't really do math and percentages and all that, but I'll be showing you guys the kind of numbers I'll personally be getting with my current Heizou build. With crit damage weapons, I used a crit rate circlet, and with crit rate weapons, I of course used a crit damage circlet just to keep it kind of even. On the left, you have all the best weapons at their max stacks and potential, and on the right, I made a chart with some more realistic numbers like Widsith at R1 and Blackcliff Agate with no stacks. As you can see though, the R5 Widsith with the Arya passive actually outdamages a lot of weapons on this list, even some 5-star options. The bad thing about the Widsith though is that you have a chance of getting 1 of 3 random passives that only last 10 seconds and has a cooldown of 30. So essentially, if you do get Arya, which is the best one out of the 3, it'll only buff 1 use of your skill, and then the next 2 will be without a passive, which basically does less damage than most of the other options. So if you're going for a big one-shot number, then Widsith is good, but if you want consistency, then let's move on. Aside from the fucking donut, all 5-star options are pretty good on him. First, let's talk about Kagura's. When you use your elemental skill, you get a damage increase for your next elemental skill for 16 seconds that can stack up to 3 times. When it's at max stacks, you get a 12% elemental damage bonus at R1. Now, people were confused if this weapon would work on Heizou because his elemental skill's cooldown is 10 seconds, so you can't possibly stack it up 3 times because the buff only lasts 16. I explained this in my first video, and I'm kind of lazy to say it again, so I'm just gonna roll the clip. Heizou's skill is 10 seconds long. A stack from Kagura's Rarity lasts 16 seconds. Now, what most people don't know about this weapon is if you cast your elemental skill before the 16 seconds ends, it actually resets that 16-second stack while giving you another stack of Kagura's Dance. The bad part about this weapon is that the full passive for the weapon will only kick in at least 40 seconds into your fight. For the outside world, this is fine most of the time, but for an area like Spiral Abyss, 30 seconds without a 12% elemental damage boost and like a 12% attack boost for your elemental skill can be that edge to not 9-starring your floor. So, like Younger Me said, you can theoretically stack it up to the max, but that's only after around 40 seconds. So, like with the Widsith, it's one of Heizou's Heizo's best in slots, but if you're going for consistency, then let's talk about some other options. In my opinion, I think Lost Prayer would be one of his best in slots, giving a shit ton of crit rate and the active character an 8% elemental damage bonus every 4 seconds when they're on field. Now to stack it up to 4, which is the max, you need to be on field for at least 16 seconds, but generally since Heizou is the main on-field attacker, he's most likely going to be on field for more than at least 8. So in most cases, you're going to be stacking it up twice. Personally though, I'm sort of biased towards crit rate weapons because I think they're just more consistent, and also I have way better crit damage circlets than crit rate. Skyward Atlas and Memories of Dust are both alright 5-star options, beating out most 4-star weapons, but I'd like to note if you're going to be using Memories, make sure to have a pretty built shielder on your team like Tomo or Diona, but Zhongli's going to be your best in slot. Alright, for 4-star weapons, the best crit options would be Solar Pearl and Blackcliff Agate. Now, Blackcliff with max stacks actually beats out Memories and Skyward Atlas at R1, but if you're fighting just one boss or an enemy without other smaller enemies to stack the passive, then it loses to Memories, Skyward, and even Solar Pearl. Again, like I talked about earlier, weapons with passives that stack are generally not as consistent as ones that don't, but their damage is similar, so just use whichever one if you need crit rate or damage. Okay, I read in the comments of my last Heizou video, people asking me about Hakushin Ring and Sacrificial Fragments. First off is the Hakushin Ring. If you trigger any electro reaction, then yes, you do get a 10% elemental damage bonus based on that element that reacted with the electro. Since the weapon is ER though, you lose out on a ton of damage, and since his ult is only a 40 energy cost, the energy recharge isn't really needed. If you're looking for a free-to-play option, then Mapamare will actually be doing more damage, so I would just say build that instead. Alright, with Sacrificial Fragments, you get EM as a substat, which does increase his swirl damage a bit, but it's really not that useful. The passive also has a chance of resetting your elemental skills cooldown if you hit an enemy with it. Now, if you hit an enemy, crit, reset your cooldown, and crit again with the second elemental skill, technically it would do more damage. But again, when it comes to consistency, my R5 sack sword on Seiun with the same passive doesn't reset his cooldown a lot of the time. So if you want to be swirling elements with Heizou a lot, then Sacrificial Fragments with EM would be a pretty good option, but again, no. Alright, the weapon section was pretty long. After I wrote the entire section, I had to take a 10-minute break because my arm hurt. But now we're on artifacts. First off and most obvious is 4-piece Viridescent, which is most likely going to be his best in slot, increasing swirl damage and decreasing enemies' resistance to whatever element you swirl. Since he's an Anemo Catalyst user, you trigger VV's passive on every single attack you do. So for example, in a national team, the on-field attacker is generally Sucrose, swirling Hydro and Pyro, buffing your Xiangling and Seiun. But since Heizou does a shit ton of damage with his E and also gives EM to party members like Sucrose, albeit not that much, he could be better in a national team. The same applies to a taser team, with Heizou swirling Hydro and Electro. If you're going to be running him as the main DPS carry, then similar to Zhao, you can run him with 2-piece VV and 2-piece Glad, Shimenawa, Echoes of Vermilion. The 2-piece set will make Heizou deal more damage, but it's at the loss of being able to decrease enemies' resistance to a certain element. If anything though, you can just run like another Anemo unit on your team with 4-piece VV. I also talked about 4-piece Shimenawas in my first Heizou video. Now, it is a pretty good option on him if you're going to be normal attacking a lot, but since he's a 4-star character and not one to really be carrying from his normals, his scaling is kind of low. So it is an option, but in my opinion, not the best one because the 4-piece set doesn't really increase his elemental skills damage, which is the main part of his kit. Another set that'll be pretty good on Heizou is 4-piece Thundering Fury in the Taser team. The set decreases your elemental skills cooldown by 1 second when you trigger any kind of electro reaction. Since he is a character that relies heavily on his elemental skill, having a decreased cooldown would be pretty good, but I wouldn't really 100% recommend you start farming it. Because of 1, the Thundering Fury domain is a pretty inefficient domain with Thunder Soother as the second artifact. 2, the set only works with a full Taser team or any team with Electro as an off-field element, so like in the open world, unless you want to be ulting with Seiun and doing a full rotation every time you want to kill a Ruin Guard, then be my guest. 3, your Heizou will be losing out on a lot of damage because Thundering Fury doesn't give Heizou any buffs to his kit. Alright, those are 5-star artifacts. Now let's talk about 4 and 3-star artifact sets. Gambler and Martial Artist would actually be really good on Heizou. Gambler increases your elemental skills damage by 20% and removes the skills cooldown when you defeat an enemy. Honestly, the 2-piece set might even be good for him, even for endgame players, something like 2-piece Viridescent and 2-piece Gambler. Since they are 4-star artifacts, you won't be getting that high base stats, but with the Flower increasing your health by like 1000 and a crit rate circlet not directly increasing your damage, it can be a viable option for new players. The Martial Artist set is centered more around normals and charge attacks. The 2-piece set increases your normal and charge attacks by 15%, and the 4-piece increases it 30% more when you hit an enemy with your elemental skill. The playstyle is going to be a little bit different, but again, it's a pretty good beginner artifact set. Alright, now the artifact sets are pretty self-explanatory, but now we're on to teams. Now, I sort of said it earlier, but even when Heizou is the main DPS of the team, he's still technically a support. Since he's just an extremely flexible unit, he can be placed on pretty much any team that has a lot of reactions and off-field DPS units. So for the first team I'm going to be talking about is a national, but replace Sucrose with Heizou on 4-piece VV, and replace Xingqiu with the Yuan if you have her. Now, this team in my opinion is probably going to be one of his best teams, with Heizou's level 70 talent giving the team 80 EM, and him just dealing a shit ton of animo damage. Another team that'll be good with Heizou is a Taser team, with him, Xingqiu, or Yuan, Fischl or Kuki if you need a healer, and Beidou. Now, this team is another good one with Heizou, and one that can use the Thundering Fury 4-piece if you want to go that route, but then again, I don't really recommend Taser teams when fighting single bosses, but the new Spiral is most likely going to have a lot of squishy enemies, so proccing a lot of electrocharge reactions on multiple guys is probably going to be pretty easy. You can also replace Beidou with Bennett to give a damage buff to all other party members on the team, because Fischl provides enough electro off-field for Heizou to proc the Thundering Fury passive. If you want to run Heizou as a main DPS, a pretty good team would be him, Bennett for an attack buff, Yuan for hydro application and off-field damage, and Zhongli for a shield and decreasing enemies' elemental resistance. I would run this team, but I don't have Zhongli, so sadly I can't, but when Zhongli gets a rerun, this team will be playable. Well, that's basically everything you need to know about Heizou. To be honest, it feels a little weird because this is one of the first times I'm way more excited about the 4-star character rather than the 5-star featured character on the current banner. But in my opinion, if you have Heizou and just happen to have a 5-star Catalyst weapon lying around, I highly recommend playing or even trying him. He's really easy to build and doesn't require that much investment. Well, anyways, onto the showcase. There's going to be a new Abyss coming out and I might make another video on it, but alas, thanks for watching. If it's too much to ask, a sub to the channel helps out a lot, makes me very happy because this little 4-digit number goes up. Alright, I'm going to stop stalling. Goodbye and enjoy the showcase.
Everybody stand! Get moving!